Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's a nice day to be together. I want to especially welcome Jake back from school. Jake was at the University of Chicago this year, and he's got a lot to share with us about that experience. On the night of Shavuot, we're going to have some of our college kids here, and they will participate in a panel speaking about their experiences on the campus or campuses this past year. I know that it was challenging, Jake, and it was a hell of a way to begin your freshman year of college. But I'm sure that you learned a great deal from it and that you've been strengthened by it, so good. You know, there's a word in Hebrew, remez. Do you know that word, remez? Probably not that many of you know it. But I first learned it when I learned the story of the rabbis who went into the Pardes, into the orchard. And they came out in with very different states of mind, different types of consciousness. And in fact, not all of them came out alive. And when the commentaries talking about what it is that they went into, what that Pardes is, they referenced it as the world of Torah. And so Pardes is spelled Pei Reish Daled Samech. The Pei stands for Pshat. So some went into the orchard and they learned Torah according to the plain, literal meaning of Torah. And some went into the Pardes and they learned Torah with remez. And remez is the hint. That is, it's that the Torah doesn't say exactly everything that you might want to hear or know, but it hints at certain ideas. Daled stands for drash, and the drash is the subjective kind of interpretation of what is in the Torah, and the final is sod, and sod means secret, the secretive meanings of Torah. Often I find in the Torah reading the remez, there's a hint of something. And that remez that I find in studying Torah during the course of the week and thinking about my comments on Shabbos morning very often is evoked by some events that are taking place in the course of our week. Perhaps it's a story that I heard from one of you. Perhaps it's from a text that I read. And this week is no different. So let me share a few connections with you. And also those of you who are concerned about politics in the pulpit, take a breath. I'm not going to be speaking about the past president. You more comfortable now? Yeah. I tend to believe that the connections that we experience are often at the heart of what we would refer to as spiritual experiences. Like, it's incredible sometimes how we're thinking about something and then we see it, or someone, and then we have an encounter with that person. And we do believe that there's something more than coincidence often. So let me consider a few different sources, and then let me tell you a story about my granddaughter Aya and her Abba Avi, and something that happened with them last Sunday. It's a fascinating story. I'll tell you at the end so you stay engaged here. The Parsha begins with a few possibilities as to what the experience or fate of our people will be. And very simply, we know this Parsha from years of reading it and from the introduction that Rabbi Applebaum gave, that it tells us that if we follow God's laws, we will be showered with blessing. And if not, if we disobey, we will meet devastation and curses. We've struggled with this Parsha for many years of our lives. We've had some apologetics which help us understand it and believe it. We're best off understanding it as metaphor. And sometimes we just want to throw it away when we've seen the amount of suffering that our people have gone through. and how often it is so difficult to truly rationalize it as being from the behavior of the people. Our people had been slaves, and in slavery we experienced every possible form of degradation. In slavery, we were worked to the bone. The rabbis teach us that when we were slaves, we worked like bent-over oxen, and we were forced to be in the most compromising of positions. We had no power, we had no control. The Midrash has taught us that our people were forced at times to lie down across the paths or the roads, while Pharaoh and his taskmasters and soldiers would walk across the backs of our people, using us as walkways. And now we're free. And now we have free choices. And so we find the following line in the beginning of the Parsha. Ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim miyot lahem avadim v'eshbor motot uchem v'olech etchem komimiyut. What does that mean? It means the following. I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your God. You would no longer be slaves. I broke the bars of your yoke, and I made you walk upright. God enabled us or made us to walk upright. So what can this possibly mean? In the context of the previous midrashim that I mentioned, it means we would no longer be stepped on. We no longer would work like oxen. You may recall the chart that reflects Darwinian evolution. We begin as sea creatures, and eventually we crawl out of the water, and then we become animals who stand on all fours, and then we become Homo sapiens. And we can walk on two legs, and we can stand upright. I don't think this is what the reference in the Torah is, but though it provides a very interesting context. More specifically, there's a particular word here, and the word is komimiyut. Komimiyut means we will stand straight. God freed us from slavery, and now we have the capacity to really appear as mentioned. We're strong people. And perhaps this is not merely a description of our people's past, but it's also a direction for the future. And I believe that we find in certain rituals an expression of this, and I'm going to get to that in a few moments. I once told you about a conversation that I had with a great scholar from Yerushalayim, someone who knew a lot about the different sects of Hasidim who live in Jerusalem. And he was able to differentiate those sects by a number of physical things in their appearance. Now, for most of us, for average Jews, we look at Hasidim and they all look the same to us, but they're not. And he would point out that the length of their coats, the nature of the material on their outer garments, whether it was shiny satin or wool, the length of their tzitzit, and even the nature of their socks, whether they were white socks or black socks, whether they were worn inside their pants or outside their pants. In the world of the Hasidim, this made a difference. Through this dress, they were identified with a particular sect and thus a particular Rebbe. Well, that particular summer, I also noticed something when I was in the Kotel Plaza, the plaza of the Western Wall. I noticed that there was a particular type of Hasid who would rush through the crowd right before he would daven at the wall. And the crowd could be pretty intense, and he would push his way through that crowd. Initially, when I would see this, I just thought it was, any old chassid. And then I began to realize that the guys who were doing this were all wearing the same coats. Kind of a silky, satiny coat. You know what I'm talking about? With a stripe in it. So they would rush through, their backs would be bent, and their faces would be towards the ground, until they arrived at the place where they would meet with their particular minyan, and there they would daven. So I asked my teacher about that, and he said they were rushing because they did not want to be guilty of what's known as bizbuzman. They didn't want to waste their time going from one place to another. With these particular Hasidim, they're using time that they could have been used to learn or to pray, and so they go quickly. Their time should never be wasted on anything frivolous, which meant anything that wasn't in the realm of prayer or learning. And they would walk bent over as a sign of their humility. When they faced God in prayer, however, he told me, they would stand upright and they would stand straight. So I want you to think about the way we begin, let's say, the blessings of the tefillah, of the Amidah. We say, Baruch Atah, and then we stand straight. When we say God's name, we're face to face with God. We're not standing bent over at that moment. We're standing straight. That means something. When we say Baruch Hu, we bow our knees, we bow at our waist, and again we stand straight when we say the name of God. Before God, we are to stand with pride. We recognize God's greatness, and we affirm the godliness in each one of us and our dignity as human beings. We do not bow at that moment. We bow before that moment, but when we're there, we're standing straight. Ritual and practice can teach us a lot about meaning. Ritual and practice can impact, if not create, a self-perception. And so when we live a life as Jews, this ritual is meant to teach us to come to our ritual, to live our lives as Jews with a sense of pride and a sense of strength and power. So the ritual is teaching us that we can't really serve God unless we're aware of our own self-worth. I know that you're asking yourself, well, what about Yom Kippur when we prostrate ourselves? And I would say that that's the time that we express humility. That's the time where we say we're not God, and there is a dependence. So it's not an absolute thing, but it's a regular practice. In the very first chapter of the prophet Ezekiel, he expresses this really beautifully. He beholds the presence of God. He is overcome by awe. And so what does he do? He throws himself down to the ground on his face. And then what happens next is quite stunning. For God says, O Son of Man, stand up on your feet so that I can speak to you. Ezekiel's not able to stand up on his own accord, so a spirit, a wind perhaps, a ruach, enters into him and sets him upon his feet. It's only then when Ezekiel is standing that God gives him this mission, his mission, and sends him away with a sense of pride in himself and an understanding of his strength in terms of what he can accomplish. Admittedly, this is an unusual encounter. Ezekiel's overwhelmed by the presence of God, and so Ezekiel falls to his face, but he receives the Spirit that says, stand up. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, but bring yourself, your full attention, and your heart to the moment. A practical message here is in a metaphor that God does not just want us to be servants, but he wants us to be dignified partners. And that's why I think we have to be careful when we sit together in shul and read prayers where we express our total dependency on God, because we cannot give up our agency as human beings, because we have the capacity to make a difference in our world. We have the capacity to make our world better. But we can't do that unless we see ourselves as a dignified and powerful partner. Well, soon it's going to be Shavuot, and we learn the metaphor that God and the people Israel, they're married. It's like a marriage that takes place at Sinai, and the Torahs are ketubah. That's a relationship of equals. In fact, although God wants reverence, he also wants our participation in the covenant. That's what's said over and over again. We are partners, and that shouldn't invade our perception of ourselves. We are important. I recall the last time before COVID when I was traveling in Europe, visiting some Catholic churches in Italy. And I also recalled visiting Catholic churches in Poland and the Czech Republic. And there was something that the European Catholic churches had in common. And that is, when you walked in and you looked to the front of the room, there's a huge crucifixion with a suffering Jesus, often bloody, and it created a sense of fear. And you as an individual walking into a huge cathedral, seeing the suffering servant up on the cross, felt very small and powerless before God. For fear is disabling. Fear cripples. Fear can inhibit us from growing, expanding, and accessing our creativity and fully expressing ourselves. Our ritual of standing straight before God is meant to teach us and remind us about something. You know, I know a lot of you. And having been here as long as I've been here, I've seen you, like myself, age a little bit. And I watch some of the people that I've known for years, for example, in the Daily Minyan, who suffer from issues, some of which are serious illnesses and some of which may not be serious illnesses, but create a lot of pain, a lot of difficulty in mobility and moving around. And I know that there are those of you, and those of you who are here, and you know who I'm talking to, who won't let it get them down, who say, in spite of the arthritis in my back, I'm going to do the best to stand straight, to stand tall, because I still have power. And when I have power, I'm going to use it, and it's going to make a difference with the way that I will face tomorrow. So here's the story that I learned, and this is a story about the impact of ritual and self-perception. And I hope you understand it in its context, and I hope you understand that my granddaughter Aya is a day school student with a firm faith in the one and only God, who observes the rituals of our people with her family very powerfully, with a great deal of spirit. So Aya's father and Avi and my other son Noah and their families, they live in central western Massachusetts. They live in an area where there were indigenous tribes long ago, and undoubtedly descendants of those tribes' people, those Native Americans, are still present. Last week there was a powwow there that was advertised, where members of native tribes from different parts of America, both South America and North America, came together. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Native Americans were together for this annual tribal gathering. There were displays of their wares, and elements of Native American culture were to be seen. And at some point, the crowd that was gathered was invited to join together in a gym inside the grounds of Amherst High School. Non-indigenous people who were there were told to sit in the bleachers and to watch as the tribal people participated in tribal dancing and drumming in loud vocalized calls. The gym was filled with noise of the ritual and celebration and loud drumming. My granddaughter Aya, who's 7 years old, she felt the power of this and its strangeness to her, and she was overwhelmed by the noise, and she snuggled into the side of her father and said, "Dad, I want to get out of here." It felt foreign, it created fear, and it inspired her to ask to get out of that gym. So Avi took her out of the gym, and as they walked around the grounds around the field, they came across a man who made jewelry and was selling jewelry, and under his tent, he was also selling sage and crystals. He learned that Aya was afraid. That's why she was walking around outside. And he told her that when you burn sage, you can get rid of the spirits that disturb you. And he said, pick a crystal. Hold on to that crystal, because the crystal can give you strength. Now, as Jews, we could look at these types of rituals and say they're part of pantheism or polytheism, and they're foreign to monotheism. But I would want to remind you that we have our own things like that. People with red bendels and people with all different types of hamsas and those types of things that people ritualize. So after listening to this guy for a few moments and standing in the middle of the sage smoke and holding her crystal, my young granddaughter looked up to her Abba and said, "Let's go back in." And so she did, and he took her back in, and she did so with comfort. And then when they got on the bleachers, they announced, anyone who wants to participate in the dancing, come on down to the floor. And Avi told me she ran down. She ran off the bleachers right down to the floor, and she did so with enthusiasm and great joy. I tell you this story for a few reasons. It should be obvious. It's not to tell you that my kids have become Native Americans, or even to support those particular rituals, but that we learn that rituals can change us. And rituals have the capacity to transform us. I know that feeling. I'll tell you when. I mean, I know it in a lot of different contexts. But when I stand at my Shabbat table and sing Shalom Aleichem and do the Kiddush, I experience that as a moment of transformation. And that no matter how difficult my week was, and no matter how tense or anxious I might be feeling, it is a moment when I'm holding that Kiddush cup where I feel kind of overwhelmed by the presence of that which is divine. Rituals allow us to internalize an idea and to create meaning and even change our self-perception. And all cultures have rituals. We must realize that we're not alone, that we can learn from others too. So let me get back to the Parsha. And the notion that we were downcast, we were forlorn, we were walked on, we were trampled upon. But God tells us to move ahead, bekomiyut, to move ahead, standing tall. And when we say a bracha and stand before God, we must stand tall. And we must have the capacity to believe that we are strong when we act in ways that are good. When we walk with God, we stand tall. When we walk in the ways of truth and compassion, we can stand proud. These are the ways of God. These are the hardest days that we've experienced in quite a long time. And I think the worst thing possible that we can do is to shrivel away in fear. Rather, we should stand tall and we should not be afraid. I was really upset at the beginning of the protests in Colombia when one of the campus rabbis told the kids to go home. There's no reason for them to go home. The only reason for them to go home was fear, an emotional fear. There was hardly any acts of violence in that horrific display. But we're so much better off when we stand with confidence, power, and strength. The secular Zionists, they knew this. They knew their fight would be tough. But they also knew that with courage and strength and standing tall, they would succeed in establishing a homeland. And we, in the framework of religious expression, know it also. The last line of Adon Olam with which we typically end Shabbat services read, Adonai li velo ira. God is with me, I won't fear. So that's the power we need. And that's what we need in this message from Torah. And that's what we need in the face of so much adversity. We continue to stand tall. Shabbat shalom, everybody.